last week we spoke about what is called de'oraisa. De'oraisa means from the Torah. Even though it was given orally, that oral stuff is not rabbinic. The rabbis did not make up that tefillin is a box of straps. That is a very legitimate oral law. That's a very legitimate oral law, and that is not rabbinic. Like shaking an esrog, that's not rabbinic. Shaking a citron, that is from the Torah. So that's the first thing that people get confused about, and we just have to make a clear line. That's not Rabbinic Judaism. That is Torah Judaism that was given over orally by God to Moshe, explained over a 40-year period to the people in the desert. It ended up being written down by Rabbi Judah the Prince, and it was written down almost a little bit less than 1,500 years, about 1,300 years after the Torah was given. But that was never Rabbinic Judaism. That was always De'oraisa Judaism. Now, we are up to today. So what is Rabbinic Judaism? Or even so, what power do the rabbis have? Why do they even make laws? So, on a very, very simple level, we would expect any society to have some sort of jurisprudence, some sort of a mechanism where things can adjust and change so that society can continue to survive and thrive through the millenniums, right? Through history. So it's not surprising that there is a governing body in Judaism that helps craft and direct the Jewish people. In the same way that we wouldn't expect not the Declaration of Independence and not the Bill of Rights to be the bottom line in how we live as Americans. But we expect there to be Congress, and we expect there to be a Supreme Court, and we expect as new cases come up, as we learn about, for example, we'll learn all about genetics, and we'll learn about grafting, technology that they simply didn't have. There was no way that the founding fathers of America were able to foresee Twitter, and whether Twitter has the right to censor different folks and what they have to say. Like, these are things that we need, that need to be dynamic. In that same way, you would expect any society that functions to have that mechanism in place, where you have living and breathing human beings that can help direct and lead the society as things change. There was a person who wrote a book. He's not a Jewish fellow, and he's a person who writes very interesting books about his experiences. So he wrote a book called My Year of Living Biblically. And basically he said, I'm going to live exactly according to the Bible, and let me see if I could function. And guess if he was able to? Of course he wasn't. Because without the oral law, I said, you don't even know what don't kill means. Does that mean I can't go to war? Does that mean I can't put a murderer to death? Does that mean I can't be a doctor and perform a surgery because I may kill the person? Like, you can't function. So certainly, this person who lived the year biblically was a big flop. Or like, for him, it wasn't a flop. He wrote a book about it, but it came out to be sort of a joke. So point number one is, you need a governing body, and the book alone is not enough. Now, how do we know that there is authority in that governing body? So the answer is, the Torah mentions in a number of places that the leaders of the generation should be listened to and heeded. It mentions it in a few different verses. As Hashem Elokecha Tira, for those of you who know the Hebrew, L'Rabbis, this includes the Torah scholars. everything they say you should listen to in terms of how Jewish law evolves. There were shoftim v'shotrim. There were judges that were put in all different parts of the land. It was never meant to be a book and just do what it says in the book. There always had to be leadership. That's how you would expect it. Okay, but what are the limits of that leadership? Or, as we would say, what are the checks and balances? In other words, what stops there from being some sort of a dictator or some sort of an ogre or some sort of a egomaniac that comes up there and just decrees things that eventually end up in jihad and end up in destruction? Why wouldn't that happen? So there's a few things to know. Number one, we know it doesn't happen because our history proves that it doesn't happen. We don't have a single character in Jewish history that the Jewish people have granted that kind of power towards. Interestingly enough, even kings had checks and balances in Judaism, which was unheard of in Rome or Greece or Persia. Even kings had checks and balances. As a matter of fact, a king has a special mitzvah, so this not very well known, but it was known for the kings, that a king had to write not one, but 2 Torahs. That means a king, writing a Torah is long, it has over 300,000 letters. It's a very big thing to write a Torah, and it has to be written on parchment with a quill in a certain way. So a king had to moonlight as an actual scribe, and not only did he write 2 Torahs, but one of the 2 Torahs, actually, he had to write very small, and it was bound to his arm, his other arm, like the tefillin were bound to his left arm. On his right arm, he'd have a Torah. So if you picture a Jewish king, you may picture a guy with a scepter, but actually you should picture somebody with a Torah strapped to his arm. Did you know that? It's like very interesting. A miniature Torah strapped to his arm like tefillin. And the lesson was clear. The lesson is that you don't have absolute power, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So Judaism never allowed for that. A great example of the lack of dictatorship would be what happened 2 weeks ago. There was a very great rabbi in Israel who passed away. His name was Rabbi Klatzko Kanevsky. He was, by all counts, the greatest rabbi alive today. He had nearly 1 million people at his funeral, and he had no power. I mean, meaning like he couldn't decree anything. He couldn't throw anyone in jail. He couldn't enact a fine. He would say things, people would take it seriously because he was what's called a gadol. He was a big person. But the rabbis don't have that kind of power, and they never did. And one of the reasons why is that in general, rabbis are not elected. When you're not elected, well, you can be a rabbi of a synagogue, be elected by it's important to know that when we say rabbi, there's rabbi, there's rabbi, there's rabbi, there's rabbi. I could be the rabbi of a Hillel, but come on, you may or may not know what you're talking about. Right? A pulpit rabbi could be a great Torah scholar, or he could be a great orator, or he could be a great fundraiser, but there's a position called rabbi. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the sages, the ones that we all look up to for guidance and advice and inspiration. Those people are not elected. And it's important to know that, because if you're not elected, that means you don't have to pander to special interests. Normally, when somebody is elected, how does it work? When a person's elected, they simply find a group of people that will vote for them, and the higher they go in office, the more groups they have to get to vote for them so that they will be elected. And the more groups you need to vote for you, the more groups you need to pander to. So it's very interesting. Most people who are voted today, I believe people who run for office, maybe in the beginning they were very sincere. right? Maybe it was just a mother who saw that there needed to be a traffic light on her street corner and they weren't putting it on, so she went around getting people to sign a petition. And she got that traffic light put in the street corner and it made the street safer for children to cross. And her neighbors came to her and said, hey, you should run for office. Look, you get things done. So she thinks, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to start running for office. And she runs, and in order to get elected, there were different groups that each wanted something. And they said, okay, if you'll vote for this, then we'll get our union to vote for you. And then when she goes on to the next higher office, she has to pander to more groups, and maybe what those groups want, maybe she wouldn't really agree with. Maybe they're not totally her value system. But you know what she does? She says, for the greater good, I'm going to give in to that special interest group because I'll be able to do such good in office that it's worth it for me to pander to this group and concede and advocate for this group and that group. And then the higher they go, the more groups they have to pander to, until eventually it becomes a real question mark. Are you giving up more than you're offering, right? Have you conceded the moral high ground to the point that you're giving so much of what you don't believe in just because you hope when you get elected you're going to do what you do believe in, but maybe you've given up more. You've sold your soul to the devil, as they say. That doesn't work in rabbinics. A rabbi doesn't get elected. So, yeah, you can have a rabbi elected to a synagogue, but a leader, Rabbikim Kanevsky, this example that I gave, he was never elected to anything. He didn't even have a synagogue. He just sat in his house and studied Torah all of his life. Wrote books, studied Torah. But it didn't make a difference because he was the leader. It rose to the top. So when rabbis become these kind of figures, there's a certain purity that's involved. And we don't, the power struggles, whenever there's a power struggle, you sort of pull away because one of the hallmarks of being a rabbi is humility. So why are you fighting to be okay, maybe you feel like you could lead your community better than the next person, but very often a really righteous person will concede, okay, I don't want to get into a fight just to be the rabbi. Now, let's talk about decrees. What's a decree? There are certain laws that the Jewish people keep that are not from the Torah, and yet they're severe. They were decrees that were made by the rabbis over the passage of time. And I want to explain to you how they came about and why they're important to us. There is a law that we don't ride a horse on Shabbat. Now, why don't we ride a horse on Shabbat? That may seem like a law that doesn't touch us today, but 100, 150 years ago, that was the transportation. Why don't we ride on horses on Shabbat? Well, so the answer is that when a person rides on a horse, what they will do very often is in order to get the horse to go, they'll give it like a little potch, a little whip on its hiney, like, let's go. And sometimes they'll be going on the horse, and the horse is like dragging its feet, and it's not really going. So what the person will do is as they're passing a tree, they'll reach out and just yank off a branch so that they can hit the horse with. This is a very common practice. You just grab a branch from a nearby tree, and breaking off a branch on Shabbat is actually a Torah prohibition. And because it was so common when people rode on horses, that was just the thing they did. That was one of the first things. They grabbed that branch. They didn't ride around with a riding crop like they were playing polo. You just grab a branch and sack. And that was so common that they forbade riding on animals on Shabbat because people were desecrating Shabbat. Give you another example. There's a rabbinic decree not to play musical instruments on Shabbat. We don't play guitar, we don't play drums. And really, it sounds like it would be better to imagine Kabbalat Shabbat, we're welcoming Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala, and it feels good and it sounds good and getting into a groove. Why is that decree made? And you will find within traditional Jews, no one's going to use a musical instrument on Shabbat. Not something you would think of, except if you're my kids and you play musical instruments. Why? Because it's very, very common when a person's playing an instrument that something will go out of tune, or something will break, or something will snap. I have a few kids that play guitar, one kid that plays violin, and it's a very common thing that as you're playing, one of the strings snap. Or the drum, something's got to be tightened. And fixing something on Shabbat is a Torah prohibition. And since there is this concern that when you play musical instruments that are usually, they're very fine-tuned, and in the middle of playing on Shabbat, something breaks and you fix it, and fixing a vessel, fixing an instrument is forbidden from the Torah. So we don't play musical instruments so that we're not tempted, oh, this went off key, or this needed, the snap ripped, so I have to put a new snap or a new tie on the drum. Because of that, we don't play musical instruments. So how did that come about? How do they decide what to make a gezerah? Gezerah is like a fence. How did that work? These are fences, so you don't transgress the law. How does a fence work? So I'll give you one of the approaches, and this is very common. There's something that the Jewish people have had for thousands of years. We still have it today. It's called a Yarchei Kala. The Yarchei Kala happens once or twice a year when you've got rabbis from congregations or from yeshivot, and they have a convention. It's the rabbi convention. Yeah, a lot of matzah balls and a lot of singing and some slivovitz, right? And the rabbis get together. And as they get together, they discuss what's going on in their community. Okay, so we're at a convention, all of us. Jeremy's there, and Hal is there, and then Isaac is there. We're all there. And as we're at the convention, I turn to you, you turn to me, and we say, hey, I got a question for you. I've been getting this question in my community a lot, that people have been playing these instruments, and then like one of the strings break, and they're in the middle of this really glorious Shabbat service. So, for the honor of the service, they want to fix their instrument on Shabbat. And of course, I tell them they can't do that. That's Torah prohibition. But they said, oh, they didn't realize, and they did it. And I turned to the rabbi next to me and said, wow, that's an issue. And the rabbi turns back to me and says, you know what? I got the same issue going on in my community. And after a while, there's like this buzz in the room. It's a buzz. People are saying, wow, this comes up a lot. This is coming up. And after a while, they make a meeting out of this, and they say, okay, has this been an issue in the community? And when you got a lot of people saying, yes, this comes up, this is real. So then what happens is they say, you know what? We've got to create a fence, because this is something that clearly is a weak link in the chain to desecrate Shabbat. And we want to be in this relationship with God. And relationships, you don't want to have an oops, O-O-O-P-S, oops, sorry. Didn't mean to, but sorry. We don't roll like that. We try to do the best that we can. And these fences are really important. I have twin grandchildren. They're 2 years old. This Shabbat, it was Shabbat afternoon, and we were at a hotel this Shabbat. I was speaking at a convention, and my wife decided to put them to sleep in the afternoon. So where did she put them to sleep? I guess the cribs weren't brought for whatever reason. So there were 2 beds in my hotel room. So one of the 2-year-olds were put on my bed, and one was put on her bed. I came in later on in the afternoon, and oh, it's so cute, 2 twins, they're identical, and they're each sleeping on the bed. It's very cute. But then I noticed that next to the twin that was sleeping on my bed was my bottle of pills. And I have my bottle of pills, and I take all my pills. I take for my heart and this and for that. And I know what they look like, so I just put them all together in one bottle. I don't have to mark it off. I know what they are. And it was on the nightstand right next to him. Now, I know my grandchildren. The very first thing this kid is doing is tasting them. And that is highly, highly, highly dangerous. Except that he couldn't open it because it had a child-proof lock and he's 2 years old. So when you click it, you lock it, and he tries to open it, he can't get it open. Thank God for a fence. That fence could have saved my grandchild's life. I wasn't there to make sure that he didn't open the bottle. Looks tempting, looks like a toy, looks like candy. So fences are what keeps us as a society safe, and it also guards Judaism and the Torah. I'll give you a very interesting fence. There is a law not to eat milk and meat together. You all heard of that? No milk and meat together, right? So cheeseburgers, out. Of course, you could get soy cheese or soy burger, and I have had the pleasure many times of having a Subway sandwich in a kosher version of Subway with the par of cheese. It's actually pretty good, but that's because it's watered down with everything else. I'm sure cheeseburgers are delicious, but they're forbidden according to the Torah. But what about milk and chicken? Now, milk and chicken should sound like it's not an issue, and I'll tell you why. Because the Torah says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, right? Except that chickens don't give milk, right? So I understand, okay, meat and milk together, because even if it's not the mother itself, the Torah is alluding to, I give another class, why it says it like that, why it phrases it like that. But the bottom line is, something that gives milk, you shouldn't cook in, it's mercy, it's cruelty. But a chicken doesn't give milk. A chicken's not a mammal, it's a fowl. So why can't I eat chicken and milk? And the law is we don't. Not only don't we eat chicken and milk, we wait 6 hours between after eating meat, before eating milk, and after eating chicken. Why? So this actually comes from that same concept. There was this Yarchikala convention. And one of the discussions were, so one of the rabbis said, hey, I got a question for you. There was this person, and he had franks, let's say, I'm just giving an example, hot dogs, franks, and he thought that they were chicken franks, so he just had them with some cheese. But chicken franks and beef franks look very similar. Today they look very, very similar because you could put the red food coloring in it. It used to be like chicken franks were a little bit lighter. You know what I'm talking about? Those who remember, the old chicken franks were lighter and the beef franks were darker. Today, you can make chicken franks look exactly the same. Okay, they make them a little bit thicker so you can tell the difference. But really, right? Or what do they call a turkey burger, a turgalorki, I forget what it's called, turkey and meat. You can take fowl and you process it, and very often it's used the same way as meat is. And what was happening was there were so many people who were taking foods, they were mixing them back and forth. They kept thinking it was chicken or turkey or some sort of fowl. It ended up being actual meat. They ended up making all their dishes not kosher. They ended up eating not kosher, and they had no ill intent. It just became a thing because the way chicken is prepared is so similar. So there was a decree. You know what? You should wait after fowl as well as meat. And that's where it comes from. Gezeros, these fences are really powerful because the history has shown that when these fences break, the dam breaks on the law. The Talmud has a very interesting story. One of the decrees, and there aren't like that many decrees, by the way, but whatever there is, we take seriously. One of the decrees is that a person is not supposed to read on Shabbat by an oil lamp. Today we have lights, so it doesn't apply, but you should read by an oil lamp. And the reason why we don't read on Shabbat by an oil lamp is, again, you'd have to be a person who uses oil lamps, but oil lamps, if the oil decreases or if the wick shifts, so then what they used to do is they used to like jiggle the the wick to make sure that it drinks up more of the oil. And when a person's reading, and that's forbidden on Shabbat, you can't increase a fire on Shabbat, that's a Torah prohibition. And what people used to do is they used to read, and they'd get really engrossed in their reading, and if the fire of the oil lamp would begin to flicker, which means it wasn't absorbing the oil properly, so as they would read, they'd go like this and just sort of fix it. And without thinking, they'd be desecrating Shabbat. So there was a decree not to read by an oil lamp on Shabbat. And then the Talmud says there was one rabbi who he was a great sage, and he said, I got total self-control. I know it won't happen to me. I could do it. I could do it. And he just, for whatever reason, whatever his calculation was, I could do it. And he began to learn Torah, and there was an oil lamp, and guess what happened to this great rabbi who said I could do it? As he's reading, he started going like this, and then he caught himself. He said, wow, I was wrong. I was wrong. There's a reason why these decrees are in place. The decrees make it clear that we take the laws of the Torah seriously. And that's a beautiful thing. By the way, this is how our society works today as well. When we figure out, for example, what the alcohol level is when you, how much you could or can't drink before you drive, and then you get a DUI if you go over, or what a speed limit should be. Or like, it evolves, but you have to have people who have a deep understanding, and that's one point. That's how decrees are made. So many different scenarios can come up when it comes to any mitzvah in the world. Thousands of scenarios. I can think of thousands in literally any case. Medical, endless, right? When it comes to keeping Shabbat, especially with today's technology. And even that, the Torah is just one book. And even the oral law that fills in the blanks, it's also contained. So how do we figure things out that continue to develop? How do we figure out what the right thing is to do? And the question's a little bit deeper. I'm in a relationship with Hashem. That's another discussion, not for right now, but the point of Judaism is to be in a relationship with God, which means that when I'm in a relationship, I want to know, what does God want from me? Just like if my wife says, oh, if you're coming home from work, can you pick up some food? But I love you, so what kind of food do you want? Do you want a hamburger, or do you want pizza? Do you want sushi? So because I love her, I'm gonna want to nail it. So we take law seriously. So I want to do it right. So what does it mean when it says, for example, to listen to shofar, right? We listen to the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. I want to do it right. So what if somebody stole a shofar? Am I allowed to listen to it? What if a little child blows, but a little child's not obligated to listen to shofar, so maybe they can't blow the shofar either? What if it's blown mechanically? Does it have to be a human being? How does it sound? What if I'm using a hearing aid? Am I hearing it with my ears, or am I hearing an impulse that's being magnified? What if I hear it over television or the computer? Like, there are on and on. You know what I'm saying? Like, we could sit here and just play with this. So how do I know what the parameters of the law are? It's a great question. And this is why Judaism is it's a serious, I don't like to call it a religion, but it's a serious religion. It takes itself very seriously, and it tries not to just dismiss things like, okay, I'll do my best and hopefully God will be happy with me. It doesn't work like that. We really try to understand, where's God coming from? He's very smart. He made, space, time, and matter. He asked us to do something. What does he mean? Now, if you've ever studied Talmud, you'll see something really interesting. You'll see that the Talmud often gives us scenarios that are bizarre. Like, there's strange cases. What could happen if I had a chicken and the chicken had a string wrapped around its foot? right? It's hopping around, gets a string tied around its foot, and then that string ends up getting attached to a pail. And as it's hopping, the pail smacks into my window and breaks it. Am I obligated? Now, when's the last time that happened? Did it ever happen in the history of ever? And the Talmud does this constantly. So what is the Talmud doing? And what I'm giving you right now is a very beautiful insight into how Talmud works. So in Talmud, you'll see these really interesting scenarios. What's going on? After I explain it, it'll make perfect sense. What the Talmud's trying to do is it's trying to create a parameter around a law to understand how far does a law stretch. So what it does is it gives me an extreme scenario, something that maybe never happened in real life, but if that extreme scenario, for example, with this chicken and the pail and the string, if in that scenario I am chayav, means I'm obligated, I'm culpable, so then let's say these are the parameters, then I know that everything within those parameters, which are more your fault, which are more likely, I'm for sure culpable for. So what I've done by giving an extreme case is I've created the parameters of a law. Let's say the law is, no, I'm not culpable, right? It's too weird and I can't be obligated if a string and it gets tied to a pail. Let's say I'm not culpable. So what does Talmud do then? It then moves the parameters in a little and says, okay, not in that case, but what about in this case? Okay, I'm still not culpable. Let's move it in a little further. What about in this case? And then eventually what you've done is you've created a framework to understand law, what is included and what's not included. Now, this is something that those people who mock rabbis, Talmud, Judaism at large, they don't understand it. But people who study law understand it very well. They understand that that's what's going on. Very interesting. I used to be a rabbi at UCLA, and I was very friendly with the dean of the law school. He's a very famous person. His name was Norm Abrams. He was a Jewish fellow. He's actually a modern Orthodox Jew. And today there's, he retired. There's the Norm Abrams Award. Like he goes down as somebody who's created tremendous law in his state. And he became the dean of the law school. And I asked him once to speak to my students at one of my events. And he spoke and he was wonderful. And then somebody raised their hand. It was a big crowd there. I actually promised the students, anyone who comes to this event, I'm going to get you a little bit of FaceTime with the dean. So all those pre-law students wanted some FaceTime with Professor Norm Abrams, so we had a lot of people come to that event. So one of the students raised their hand and they said, got a question. What's the difference between Talmud and law? Interesting question, because Talmud is very cerebral. It's very jurisprudence focused. It's very legal. And it sounds like law. And Norm Abrams said the following. He said, actually, it is so similar, the logic is so similar that he will take students straight from yeshiva to law school. They could skip undergrad, because their minds are so calibrated to thinking in these terms. They usually excel in law school. He said there is one difference, though, between a Talmudic student and a law student. He said in Talmud, we tried to get rid of gray area. You're either obligated, you're not. You have to do this, you're guilty, you're not guilty. We try to get rid of gray. And in law, you try to introduce gray area. Yeah, you think he's a murderer, but maybe they didn't murder. Maybe it wasn't premeditated. Maybe they were somewhat insane. Maybe they were under duress. So you introduce gray area, while in Talmud, we try to remove gray area, because Talmud's trying to figure out what God wants, and gray area is not good, because then I don't know what God wants. Now, how do I figure out law in the Talmud? How do I figure things out? How do I know whether to move in the walls of the parameters of a law? So now we're going to get to something else that's very interesting. The Torah actually puts in 13 mechanisms that you can figure out any law that comes up, no matter how far into the future it is. Using 13 mechanisms, you can figure out law in the future. Now the laws, those mechanisms, these tools are intellectual tools, and they're used sometimes by themselves, sometimes they're used in tandem. They're known in Hebrew as the Yud Gimel Midot, the 13 measures She'at Torah Nidreshes B'hem, that the Torah is understood from. So, and some of them are so similar to law, that to normal law, that they actually are the same, and they're called something different because they're called their Hebrew or Aramaic counterpart, but they're the same. I'll give you an example. There's a law, one of the 13 principles, that's known as Kal v'chomer. Kal means light, and chomer means heavy. And I can figure out a law using a Kal v'chomer. The mechanism works like this. If Harold, who cannot lift 100 pounds, can lift my computer, then Jeremy, who could lift 100 pounds, could for sure lift my computer. That's known in law as an a priori, and in Torah, in Gemara and Talmud, that's known as Kal v'chomer. It's one of the mechanisms that we use to figure out laws that are not explicit in the Torah. So therefore, if something comes up in the future, I'll say, yes, this case is not mentioned, but I can know it from a Kal v'chomer from another case, because this case is even more severe. So if the law over here is like this, then surely the law over there must be like that. That's one of the 13 principles. And what we do, and this is a lot of what Talmud does, when Talmud rabbis, when you study Talmud, when they have disagreements, they're not just yelling at each other. What they're doing, and this is really sharp, what they're doing is they say, what's the law in a certain case? And one rabbi will say, well, using principle 1 and 4, the law would be that they're guilty. And then another rabbi would say, no, but principle 5 overrides both 1 and 4, and therefore the person's innocent. And they use the mechanisms to have this debate in what the law should end up being, what the mitzvah is, what the Torah is trying to say. That's exactly how we do it in the secular world. We have certain principles, we have certain precedences where we could see a law was in the books, maybe it was from the 1800s and no, it was never used. Maybe it was a law like Roe versus Wade that was enacted much more recently. And we have a law, then we have another law, then we try to figure out based on the scenario, is it exactly the same? Maybe it's a little bit different. All of this tells me the following, that built into the Torah is a way to figure out how to live as a Jew in the year 2022. And it's not guesswork. So for example, if I go to the local rabbi of my synagogue/temple and I tell him, do I have to do this? And he says, oh, it's a rabbinic thing. Your answer should be, what does that mean, rabbinic thing? Did you mean offense? Was it something that was figured out from the 13 principles? Was it oral law? Which one of the three? They're all three very different. Oral law is not really rabbinic, it's really from the Torah. If it's figured out from the 13 principles, the principles themselves come from Torah. If it's a decree, then you're right, then it's not actually Torah, but it's a decree that the Torah says to listen to the rabbis and the Jewish people have accepted upon themselves. Or there's a fourth scenario, which is maybe it's minhag. What does the word minhag mean? Minhag means custom. there are certain laws that the law came about because it was a custom of the Jewish people to do a certain thing, and usually that custom had a halachic, a Jewish law reason behind it. What kind of fish do we eat on Shabbat? The gefilte fish. Did anyone here ever go fishing and catch a gefilte fish? There's no such thing as a gefilte fish. Did you know that? There are sardines, there are salmon. There's no such thing as a gefilte fish. So what is gefilte fish? It's known in English as fish loaf, which sounds very unsavory. But you put a good amount of the red horseradish on top and you're good to go. Nice little sweet carrot. It's delicious when you're in the right frame of mind. Not on a Tuesday for lunch, but right on Shabbat morning, it's delicious. Friday night. Why do we eat gefilte fish? Why is there a custom like that? Well, that custom actually comes from Jewish law. There is a law that on Shabbat, you cannot separate the bad from the good. You cannot separate bad from good on Shabbat. It's called borer. It's one of the 39 laws of Shabbat. Not getting into why that is now, but trust me, it's a biblical law. It's not a negotiated thing. It's a biblical, not separate bad from good. So usually, where did this apply? Usually this applied to farmers who would have to separate the wheat from the chaff. So it was a farmer thing, and the Torah forbade it because of that, but separating the bad from the good could happen anywhere. Like I could have a bunch of Legos, and I tell my kids, like they want to get rid of all the yellows, or you got a bunch of jelly beans, jelly bellies, and you don't like the blacks. So you go into your jelly belly thing and you get rid of the blacks. That's not allowed on Shabbat. We don't separate the bad from the good. So where did this come up very often? This came up when eating fish. Because when I have a nice piece of salmon steak, not a salmon fillet, but a salmon steak, what does it have? A lot of little thin bones. So what people do is they go and they pull out the bones, and that is called borer on Shabbos. So we don't separate the bad from the good on Shabbos. So the Jewish people, because of that biblical law of not separating bad from good, they invented a fish with no bones. And the name of that fish was called gefilte fish. So, and by the way, this is for everything. This for challah, even for cholent, has a halachic background, a halachic reason why it was created. So gefilte fish suddenly is not just a weird ethnic fish and jelly, but it has a halachic basis. So when we have customs, we shouldn't just discard them. Even though, we got Tevye dancing around tradition, and we're like, wow, it's so sweet, tradition. But traditions or customs are actually really important in Judaism. And there's even a saying in the Talmud that says, minhag kedin, a custom has the severity of a law. Now, it depends what kind of custom. So this is where, and I'm going to finish with this idea, this is where the great saying in Pirkei Avot comes into play. And the saying is, aseh lecha rav, make for yourself a rav, a Torah scholar, a rabbi who knows his beans. Make yourself a personal rabbi. Find that go-to person and be able to call them and ask them your questions. Because the truth of the matter is, outside of a person who has devoted their life to understanding Torah, most of us and most of our Jewish education ended when we were pretty young. Yeah, we dabbled here and there, but let's face it, people go to college and grad school till they're 25, 26. Not many people are learning Talmud, except for, again, those yeshiva Talmud students who are really serious. Most people, they went to Sunday school, or they went to, maybe elementary school, maybe they hated it, maybe they were confirmed, maybe they learned for their bar mitzvah, but they were kids when they finished. I don't even think that real intellectual Jewish knowledge can enter a person's brain until they're 18. That's my experience. I heard from a great rabbi once that 16-year-olds don't have a brain. And I have a 16-year-old, so I know what the rabbi means. Like they got feelings and emotions, and we love them, but they're very involved. They're very self-absorbed, many of them, like high schools and cliques and politics, and that's one thing I hope never to be a teenager again. If there's reincarnation, like no, I don't want to go through 11th grade. No more 11th grade. So, but when we're 18, our brains become more developed. And that's why, college begins at that age, and we begin to really understand things, except for a lot of people, their Jewish education is finished by then. So if you have a chance to go study in yeshiva, that's optimal. And when I see people who go and they're a little bit older, they get much more out of it. But if a person can't, then at the very least, they should have a really competent, halachically knowledgeable rabbi on their speed dial. And I want to tell you that even rabbis have rabbis on their speed dial. And I do as well. Because no one knows everything. And we want to do it right. We don't want the gravity of Judaism. The gravity is called halacha. Halacha is Jewish law. That's the gravity that keeps Judaism in place. The moment halacha is abandoned is the moment the Jew sort of drifts off into the right? Because there's nothing that ties me. I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, and I'll call it Judaism. In the same way that I can't just make up baseball, anything is called baseball. Instead of 4 bases, I'll make 6 bases. And instead of a round ball, I'll use like a little football-shaped ball. Instead of a bat, I'll use a broomstick, right? Eventually, that's not baseball. So halacha is the gravity that keeps Judaism, Judaism. So that's a little bit about Rabbinic Judaism. There's much more. What I wanted you to get out of this is that it's not fly by night. It's not, shoot from the hip. It is formulated and developed and learned by tremendous scholars over 2,000 plus years, much more than that. That's just since the temple, really over 3,000 years. Our rabbis are known to be tremendous geniuses in their breadth and in their depth. They're also known to be people of high moral character, because people who are not never rose to the top. Right? People who are morally decrepit, they can be the biggest geniuses, but we're not going to listen to them because they can't back up what they purport, what they say, what they preach with their own actions. So as a Jewish nation, we dismiss them. They're not what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody whose insides reflect their action, their outsides reflect what they preach, and those are the people who we look up to for guidance. They're not mullahs, they're not elected officials. Rabbikim Kanevsky never got a penny for being this great rabbi, and yet 1 million people at his funeral didn't get 1 penny for being a rabbi, didn't have one, was not a pulpit rabbi, did not have a yeshiva. The cream rose to the top because people acknowledged that. So that is Rabbinic Judaism. I thank you all for listening.